Hello everyone, my name is David Lightbringer, and I've been defending Daenerys Targaryen online for over a decade, advocating for, you might say. That's right folks, long before I came here to rather chilly Australia on vacation in the year 2022, and it's a bit birdy out, so if you hear any bird calls, that's what's going on. And long before the Golden State Warriors won any of their four NBA titles, long before the controversial HBO ending about 3 years ago, all the way back since 2011, guys, when merely mentioning Dany on fan forums was basically the death knell for civilized, reasonable conversation. Then as now, the fury of what I would call irrational Dany hate is still nothing compared to the passion felt by those who support her. Why is this? Why do people love Daenerys Targaryen so much? Is it really just because she's a sexy dragon lady and hashtag strong woman, as some suggest? No, of course not. Now, I'm not suggesting there's any lack of appreciation for a good old sexy dragon lady or a sexy dragon man for that matter, and if they have sex on a boat, who's complaining? Well, besides this guy. But no, seriously, the reason we love Dany is because she's the character in A Song of Ice and Fire who does the most to help other people, right? She comes up from nothing, being sold into marital slavery at the age of 13 after growing up an orphan, and then by the second book, she's basically become teenage Spartacus, leading an uprising of slaves in the overthrow of their masters in Astapor. The first time Dany witnesses a Dothraki raid in a Game of Thrones, which is presented to her as the cost of the Iron Throne, says Ser Jorah, Dany upends Dothraki custom and begins taking prisoners of war under her protection, to the great fury of some of Drogo's blood riders and co's. Of course, in A Storm of Swords, Dany refuses to leave Slaver's Bay to attack Westeros when she has the opportunity, instead choosing to take responsibility for the fallout of the slave uprising that she helped start, and to instead try to bring peace and stability to the people that she was already responsible for in Meereen. Then, when her refugees are sick of the bloody flux, they're camped outside of Meereen's walls. They can't be let in the city, of course. They're trying to quarantine and contain the plague, but Dany goes and walks amongst them, cares for them personally as best she can. So Dany isn't perfect, but she's definitely the character who most consistently sticks her neck out for others, who uses the supreme power of her dragons to defend the weak and to try to make the world a better place. That's why people believe in her, or you might say that we believe in what she represents. Daenerys Targaryen, age 15, really said, "Why do the gods make kings and queens if not to protect the ones who can't protect themselves?" And then woke up the next day and burned those slave masters full in the face with Drogon's fires, freed 8,000 unsullied and hundreds of other child soldiers in training, and then planted her flag squarely on abolitionism in the heart of Slaver's Bay. And Rhaenyra is nothing like her. That's right, please don't disrespect the memory of Daenerys Targaryen by simply transferring the emotions you have for her character onto the character of Rhaenyra, simply because you see another disinherited Targaryen princess fighting to claim the throne. That would be a mistake, because Rhaenyra, and this is important, so listen close, never does a single thing to help anyone but herself. So stop, don't turn the video off. If you're upset at what I just said, then please tell me why I'm wrong in the comments, because the actions of the main characters are going to be debated all through the show, so this conversation isn't going anywhere. And if you support Rhaenyra, I'd hope you have some reasons that go beyond, yeah, Team Black all the way. Daemon and Rhaenyra are the coolest. And I'm not saying you sound like that, but you know what I mean. I trust you're coming to this YouTube channel ready for a discussion that goes a little deeper than that. And I'm definitely not saying that Rhaenyra is purely a villain, or that there aren't many reasons to sympathize with her or even root for her in certain circumstances. What I am saying, though, is that the first and really the only duty of any human being placed in a position of political power over other human beings is, of course, to put the well-being of their people before anything else, especially before their own personal desires. And it's just hard to make the case that Rhaenyra does that, at least from what we know of her in Fire and Blood. I went into this in more detail in the Team Green or Team Black video that kind of frames the discussion that we're having now. But that's the bottom line. Even while we relate to and sympathize with the main characters, we are also supposed to remember that the main characters are High Lords, whose first responsibility is to the general welfare of the people of the realm. Hashtag Team Smallfolk. And look, lest anyone say I'm taking a fantasy show about dragons too seriously, I can hear those comments coming, at least a couple of them. Consider that George R.R. Martin basically hits us right in the face with this moral statement about the duty of rulers and the horrors of war right from the start. To wit, he named the first book A Game of Thrones, which is a title taken from the line in that book which asks, "Why is it always the innocents who suffer most when you high lords play your Game of Thrones?" Then George follows that up with Dany's statement in A Storm of Swords about kings and queens having the duty to protect the vulnerable. Then we get the Broken Man speech in A Feast for Crows, which personalizes the horrors of sending men to war. There's also Dany's dream vision of the carnage of the War of the Five Kings being depicted as a bunch of radish dwarf men biting and tearing at a woman's body, with a woman's body clearly representing Westeros and the people of Westeros, and so much more, which we've been talking about a lot recently and which hopefully all of you are familiar with. So as I mentioned in the Team Green or Team Black video, the story that House of the Dragon is telling is a story about a dreadful civil war which plunged most of the realm into carnage and horror, and therefore it's first and foremost a story about how the leaders in power failed to protect their people. And by the way, if you hear what sounds like sheep in the background, those are actually crows. It turns out that crows in Australia all bleat like sheep, all of them. It's some sort of trick they use to lure the baby lambs away so they could peck their eyes out and kill them. It's kind of horrible. But yeah, the crows here don't sound like American crows. It's weird. So there's like sheep in the trees. Sheep up in the trees, blah. It's the funniest fucking thing. Anyway, so like I said, House of the Dragon, it's a story about a civil war, about how the leaders basically failed their people. And remember, the succession crisis, that is the Game of Thrones. That's the High Lords literally fighting over a chair at the expense of the lives and the well-being of tens of thousands of common people. Hashtag Team Smallfolk. That's why, in general, I tend to be pretty critical of most of the main characters. Everyone who had a hand in starting this war is essentially culpable for thousands and thousands of deaths, and therefore has failed the primary test of leadership. In other words, if you think House of the Dragon is essentially some sort of princess party for Rhaenyra, or a celebration of Daemon's roguishness, well, you're sadly mistaken. I mean, it is those things, but it's a lot more than that. So, along the same lines, I mean, yes, we're all here to cheer for the sexy dragon lords doing sexy dragon lord things, and that's fine, that's part of it. But we're also supposed to pay attention to the thousands of people dying beneath the feet of their dragon dance, so to speak. And I know I'm being a bring down, but just remember, the right to sit the Iron Throne comes only to Rhaenyra, or anyone else, in the context of feudal monarchy, and it's actually more of a responsibility than a right. George draws our attention to this with a very important lesson that Stannis has to learn after failing to take King's Landing and seeing thousands of people burn and drown in his attempt. With the help of Davos, his own personal Jiminy Cricket, if you will, Stannis realizes that he essentially had his priorities backwards. Seaworth is a man of humble birth, but he reminded me of my duty when all I could think of was my rights. I had the cart before the horse, Davos said. I was trying to win the throne to save the kingdom, when I should have been trying to save the kingdom to win the throne. This statement is a clear condemnation of both Team Green and Team Black, and essentially any claimant to the throne more concerned with their rights than the duties of the throne that they want to sit on. That means Rhaenyra and Daemon and Corlys and Rhaenys the Queen Who Never Was on one side, and of course also Otto, Alicent, Criston Cole, Aegon II, and all the rest on the other. If even one side, let alone both, had kept this ideal in mind, then war may have been avoided. Now it must be said, there is of course always the caveat of Fire and Blood having been written as an unreliable history record set down by the Maesters, which includes both the fog of history and the general anti-Targaryen, anti-magic, and anti-women bias of the Maesters. And it does seem that Rhaenyra and Daemon are presented in a pretty unfavorable light throughout. Now that could be because they made a lot of poor decisions, which they definitely did, Rhaenyra especially, but we should also expect that there may be facts left out which change the way that we view certain decisions. We also know that the showrunners of House of the Dragon have to choose between the various possible realities set out in Fire and Blood when they write their scripts. And I suspect that they will look to make many of the culprits of the war, if you will, sympathetic to the audience as much as possible, especially in the beginning. It's simply a better story if everyone isn't purely selfish and corrupt from the start, right? That's why I titled my Alicent video with the question, is Alicent a villain? I started with the working assumption that most people probably view her as a villain, what with her being the chief organizer of the coup and often reminding us of Cersei Lannister by the end. And then I asked the question of whether or not there might be a more sympathetic light to view some of her actions in. In some cases, the answer was yes, particularly where it seemed like some of her ideas might have helped prevent the war had they been taken up or enacted. But of course, in the end, Alicent is highly culpable for the war having broken out, and thus she is one of the rulers who failed to protect her people. In the case of Rhaenyra, I think many people may think of her as the good guy, or something like that, simply because she was Viserys' named heir, and because on the surface, she might remind us of Dany. So I just kind of wanted to start out by giving you the somewhat harsh truth that she's definitely no Dany. We are going to look for places where Rhaenyra might be more sympathetic than appears at first, just like we did with Alicent, but I did want to give it to you straight. Rhaenyra is no leader of uprisings, no crusader against injustice. She really does nothing to make the world a better place, which is Dany's best quality. So please, don't make the mistake of transferring the affection you have for Dany, which she definitely earned, onto Rhaenyra, because they just aren't similar people at all. And please note, when I'm talking about Daenerys, I'm talking about primarily the character in the books, but also the character on the show up until the last 3 episodes when Dave and Dan did their Hitler-Dany heel-turn ending. It's important to note, in case you don't know, that's definitely Dave and Dan's ending. They've taken credit for that. It's not George's ending. Both parties have given us quotes that make that clear. And as I explained at length in my 90-minute Who is the Real Dany video, like I said, I've been advocating for Dany pretty hard online, this evil Dany ending completely goes against the character that she had been up to that point. And the key thing to realize is that D&D turned her into a villain precisely by making her violate her own maxim about the gods making kings and queens to protect the ones who can't protect themselves, which is a line they chose not to use from the books, by the way. But again, the point is that this is the moral axis of A Song of Ice and Fire, particularly for the leaders and those with political power. So while I don't think that Dany will violate that in her book ending as she did on the show, the overarching point I want to give you is that when the High Lords try to claim the throne at the expense of the suffering of the people, they become the villains of the story. So the first reason why people sympathize with Rhaenyra, I think, is that she's attempting to be the first High Queen of Westeros. It's obviously unfair and stupid that only men are allowed to rule, and it's natural to want to see those sorts of ridiculous standards get torn down. Queen Alysanne chafed about it with King Jaehaerys for their entire lives, and then the Great Council of 101 AC passed over the far superior female candidate, Rhaenys, for an inferior male candidate, Viserys, and that's the Viserys who is king on House of the Dragon. And this really is a clear-cut case. Rhaenys was 26, rode the fearsome dragon Meleys, had made a royal progress with Jaehaerys, and was accounted both wise and fierce. Rhaenys was married to Corlys Velaryon, who was of course both the richest man in the Seven Kingdoms and the most powerful naval commander in the Seven Kingdoms. And Rhaenys' father, Prince Aemon, was the firstborn son and heir of King Jaehaerys, well-loved by the people. Viserys, meanwhile, was 24, but had not studied under Jaehaerys, and more importantly, no longer rode a dragon. He did mount the great Balerion the Black Dread one time, but Balerion was very old, passed away the next year, and Viserys never claimed another dragon. So by this time, he is dragonless, and Rhaenys is riding Meleys, the Red Queen. Viserys was the son of Balon, the younger brother of Aemon, who was also well-loved, but he was the younger brother of Aemon. Most importantly, we have the perspective of history to know that Viserys turned out to be a pretty terrible king. So there's little doubt that the Great Council got that one wrong simply for the sake of preserving the precedent of male primogeniture. Rhaenys is called the Queen Who Never Was for a good reason. She was very clearly a great monarch waiting to happen, but for sake of her having the wrong naughty bits, as they say. So when Viserys names Rhaenyra his heir in 105 AC, it feels good, and it'll feel good when we see that on the TV show. It seems like a righting of the wrong of Rhaenys being passed over, and perhaps catharsis for those of us who watched people essentially steal Dany's throne on the last 3 episodes of the TV show. And it would be just a plain old victory for common sense, in that the idea of only men being allowed to hold power is obviously unjust and stupid. So the first big problem with this is that neither Viserys nor Rhaenyra ever attempt to change the law so that other women can inherit their own royal houses. They just want an exception for Rhaenyra. The Great Council of 101 had just set the legal precedent of strict male primogeniture only 4 years before, and then here comes Viserys just disregarding that precedent without actually changing the law. This placed Rhaenyra in a bad position from the start, because there's now an inherent conflict between the understood legal precedent and the word of the king, which is, of course, also supposed to be law, and is law. This is also a pretty bad lesson in ethics for Rhaenyra. She was essentially taught that she had rights, not that women should have rights. And this comes against the wider backdrop of the general godlike entitlement claimed by all Targaryens, such as the freedom for the Dragonlords to take multiple wives, or to marry their siblings, cousins, aunts, and uncles, and, most importantly, the right to sit the Iron Throne and rule the Seven Kingdoms. Rhaenyra would have grown up saturated in this environment and would have been inculcated with that belief of Targaryen superiority, and it is from this mindset that Viserys and Rhaenyra conceive of her right to the throne as a special case and an exception to the law. And lo and behold, when Rhaenyra eventually does take power in King's Landing during the war, she specifically chooses to uphold the precedent of male primogeniture when she had the chance to go against it. And this is after her younger brother Aegon II used that very legal precedent to usurp Rhaenyra and claim the throne. So here's what I'm talking about. After Rhaenyra executes the lords of Rosby and Stokeworth as traitors for allying with the Greens, Rhaenyra decides to award the houses of Rosby and Stokeworth to their sons, even though their oldest children were women. It's argued there that Rhaenyra's claim to the throne was a special case because Viserys specifically named her his heir, and therefore could not be used as precedent, which is a bit of a lark since that argument came from Corlys Velaryon, who pushed for his own wife Rhaenys to inherit the throne at the Great Council of 101 AC, even though she was never named the heir. In other words, Rhaenyra is doing nothing to upend the unjust political system which victimized her, even when she has the chance and the power to do so. And that's exactly the opposite of what Daenerys does. When Daenerys burns the slavers of Slaver's Bay, she's actually tearing down the heart of the same slave economy that ensnared her at 13 when she was sold to the Dothraki by Illyrio, because of course the Dothraki buy slaves and take prisoners of war and then feed them on to Slaver's Bay and the gristmill of slavery and Unsullied and all the rest. Now, perhaps this difference in empathy and what I would call a moral compass in part derives from these very striking difference in their upbringings, right? Rhaenyra grew up the most pampered child in the kingdom, spoiled endlessly by her father and named the realm's delight. And Fire and Blood does specifically say that Rhaenyra was spoiled and that her father could never say no to her. Dany, on the other hand, of course, grew up an orphan, suffered various kinds of abuse, was sold into marital slavery. There are some of the sheep crows. Dany was sold into marital slavery, and then, of course, she had her son and husband both die tragically, all before she turned 15. Daenerys did not grow up thinking that she was the heir. That was Viserys. She was just the heir's sister who maybe would marry her brother or something if they ever got lucky enough to retake their lands. And Daenerys also was not inculcated into the beliefs of Targaryen supremacy, if you will. And you can even see the difference between Dany and Viserys in this regard, with Viserys having experienced the pampered royal life of silks and servants, which Dany never knew. And obviously their behavior and their level of entitlement and all that stuff is very different. Now, I have seen some people try to excuse, or perhaps you might say, add mitigating context to some of Rhaenyra's poor decisions, if you will, by bringing up the difficult circumstances under which Rhaenyra took the throne. And that's definitely fair. We've already mentioned some of that today, the bad position that Viserys put her in, and we'll talk a lot more about that in the next Rhaenyra video, where we sort of go through all the major events of her life like we did in the Alicent video and discuss the ramifications of each one. The thing is, the same can be said for Dany. She also took power amid war, turmoil, and the treasonous plotting of enemies from within. Yet the way that Rhaenyra and Dany handle that power really couldn't be more different. Daenerys, for example, begins implementing reforms in Meereen immediately, despite the political cost, while Rhaenyra's half-year of misrule in King's Landing is pretty much the opposite, and includes the example I gave earlier of upholding male primogeniture for everyone except Rhaenyra, as well as a fair bit of mismanagement and also torture. Now, Dany's management of Meereen isn't perfect, of course, but she's making all of her decisions based on what she thinks will bring peace and stability to Meereen, while all of Rhaenyra's decisions when in power in King's Landing, and long before then actually, are basically made out of self-interest or at best self-preservation, and they come at great cost to her subjects, most importantly. Although there are reasons to take Rhaenyra's side in some cases and to view her choices in a sympathetic light, it's really very hard to come up with any example of her putting the realm first or trying to leave it a better place for those who come after. So there you have it. Whatever else is said about Rhaenyra, I think we really have to let her character blaze her own path. She's no Daenerys, and really only has weak parallels to Dany's story, so it's probably a good idea to just set the Dany stuff aside mentally when watching Rhaenyra grow up on House of the Dragon. Rhaenyra is a very complex and compelling character in her own right, and because so much of her story as written in Fire and Blood is shrouded in mystery, hearsay, and controversy, we really can't be sure exactly what kind of character is going to come through on the TV show. The showrunner's ability to portray that complexity will definitely be a big part of whether House of the Dragon succeeds in evoking the passions of the audience. So Rhaenyra is definitely one of the characters that we're looking forward to seeing on House of the Dragon. So thanks for watching, folks. Check out the House of the Dragon playlist linked in the description below for more House of the Dragon videos. Make sure to like the video if you liked it. Click on the subscribe button and the notification bell so you always get a notification when we go live. And we will definitely always go live whenever any sort of House of the Dragon breaking news happens, new trailer, anything like that. We'll be here to cover it, and we'll be going live after every House of the Dragon episode this season with a post-game show. We'll be doing videos during the week, so that's it. Make sure you're subscribed. Thanks to all my patrons and YouTube channel member squishers, and I'll see you again real soon. Now I'm gonna go climb that tree and shear some sheep, I guess. Ah!